This is Anwar Syed. He's an Uber driver. In February, he was out on a normal day driving for Uber when he picked up an abnormal passenger named Philip Ganado. Now, as soon as Ganado got in Mr. Syed's vehicle, he began to ask Mr. Syed a series of questions. The first was, "Where are you from?" To which Syed responded, "I'm from Pakistan." Ganado then asked Mr. Syed, "What is your religion?" Syed then responded, "I'm Muslim." Ganado then grew noticeably irritated and asked Mr. Syed to pull over his vehicle to the side of the road. He then grabbed the flashlight, which was located on the center console of Mr. Syed's vehicle, and began to brutally beat Mr. Syed. He ended up leaving him unconscious on the side of the road with a fractured eye socket. This is how he looked after the attack. He was in the hospital for 5 days recovering. This is one of many Islamophobic attacks that have occurred since the 2016 election. And these attacks have me worrying not only about myself, being that I identify as an American Muslim of Pakistani descent, but they have me worrying a lot about my family. Because it's one thing to do that to me, but it's another thing to do that to someone who I care about, to do that to my mom, or my dad, or my grandma. And I find myself more and more being concerned about their safety. And I really don't feel like I should have to worry about that. And the fact that I do really makes me angry. And so what I find also very troubling about the attack is that it didn't really surprise me when I heard about it, because instances like these are becoming so common in our country. And so here, you can look at the data for yourself. The above graph is from the Pew Research Center, showing a steep rise in anti-Muslim assaults in 2015. The bottom one is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, showing a tripling in anti-Muslim hate groups. A tripling. Now, as I said, this is no doubt because of the 2016 election, where we saw Islamophobic rhetoric become normalized. It became politically advantageous to say things like, "We have a Muslim problem in America," or "Islam hates us." Now, contrary to the popular belief, this type of rhetoric is not just from the right. It also comes from the left. Bill Maher, for example, is the left's most prominent Islamophobe. Now, if you were to ask Bill Maher, or even Donald Trump for that matter, about the attack on Mr. Syed, they would no doubt condemn it immediately. However, if you were to talk to them about their rhetoric, if you were to talk to them about when they say things like Muslims are inherently opposed to American values, they would not take their foot off the gas. Now, what they fail to realize, or maybe they just don't care, is that that type of rhetoric legitimizes the actions of people like Mr. Ganado, because it fuels the flame burning inside those with hate in their heart. Because it, in a sense, proves them right. For when someone thinks that Muslims are evil, when they hear people like Donald Trump or people on Bill Maher, people from both sides of the political spectrum, they are, in a sense, proven right. And so really, for anyone to say that Muslims are inherently opposed to the United States is just flat out wrong. There's 1.6 billion Muslims on the planet. If 1.6 billion people really wanted to see the downfall of the United States, the globe would be a much more volatile place. Nevertheless, it is important to discuss, for the people who do wish to commit terror in the Muslim world, the very small percentage of people out of that 1.6 billion, it's important to discuss where those motivations come from. And in order to find the answer to that, we do not need to look at scripture, but instead we must look at history. So let's take a step back. It's World War I. A series of entangling alliances and a steep rise in nationalism lead to the most catastrophic conflict the globe has ever seen. We see the Allied powers, featuring much of the West, squaring off against the Central powers, featuring Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Now, for our discussion, the Ottoman Empire is the most important because they're Turkish, they're Muslim, and they control large parts of the Middle East, large parts of the Muslim world. And so, in the Ottoman Empire's suspected decline, the European powers see great opportunity. So in 1916, during the middle of the war, a British diplomat named Sykes and a French diplomat named Picot get together to plan out how they want to divide up Ottoman territorial holdings in the Middle East. As you can see here, there's a French zone of control as well as a British zone of control. And now this is no doubt meant to further their interests. Interestingly, this agreement will run in direct contradiction to the U.S. president's 14 points. For you see, American President Woodrow Wilson wanted to remake the world at the end of World War I. For in his mind, in order to prevent such a conflict from ever occurring again, the world needed to be remade to be free, in which themes of self-governance and self-determination would be stressed. And so he laid this out in kind of his vision for the world, or in his 14 points. Right here's point 5, the second half of which is the most important. It reads, "The interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government, whose title is to be determined." So again, we get that theme of self-governance as well as consent to the governed, freedom. However, despite the European powers' tacit agreement with Woodrow Wilson's point, following World War I, they went ahead and instituted the imperialist governments, which they talked about in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And so they would become known as mandate governments. Now, Arab leaders were quick to call out the West on what they viewed as hypocrisy. For they would say that, okay, so you spout all this grand rhetoric about freedom, about self-determination, however, here you are imposing imperialist governments upon us. And so there were revolts. The picture on the left is from the 1925 Syrian Revolt, where you saw Syrians gather together in their attempts to break free from French control. French firepower proved superior, and so the French squashed the rebellion. Nevertheless, this is a critical contradiction between Western stated values of freedom and self-determination and Western actions of imperialism. Let's jump to World War II. In August of 41, the United States is not completely committed to the war effort. However, it senses that it will need to take an increasing role. And so again, the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, feels that the world needs to be remade to be more free, basically. And so him and the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, signed the Atlantic Charter, which has a tone similar to that of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Part of it reads, "Both countries agreed to respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live." So again, you get that similar tone, self-determination, consent to the governed. However, much like the Europeans after World War I, America went back on its word. After World War II, you get the Cold War, where America squares off against the Soviet Union. Now, America and the West feels that they need every advantage possible to combat the Soviet Union. And so they feel one of their interests being threatened in 1953 in Iran. For you see, Iran at the time had a democratically elected prime minister, pictured on the right, named Mohammad Mossadegh. And he wanted to nationalize the country's oil, which would basically benefit Iran and mitigate the amount of Western influence being exercised on Iran and its oil. America felt very threatened, and so they partnered with the British to overthrow the democratically elected government and installed their own ruler. This individual, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who ruled like an autocrat. He tortured political dissidents, abolished opposing political parties, and had a secret police. In essence, he ruled in direct contradiction to the values outlined in the Atlantic Charter. And so the Iranians grew disillusioned with the Shah's rule. And so in 1979, they engaged in a revolution and overthrew the American installed ruler. Their leader, pictured on the poster on the left of the screen, was Ayatollah Khomeini. He was a Shia cleric. Now, when people look at this revolution, they look at it primarily through a religious lens, when they say this is when fundamentalists took control of Iran. Now, that is significant, yes. However, what is also significant is the social justice narrative, which really was utilized in this revolution. For you see, Ayatollah Khomeini painted the United States as this oppressive power which did not respect Muslim rights, Muslim lives, or Muslim bodies. And he really didn't have to try too hard to point that out to the Iranian population, considering that their democratically elected government was overthrown by a foreign power in 1953. So it wasn't too difficult to really galvanize the population. Let's put this in a domestic context for our sake, right? So right now, Americans are freaking out because Russia interfered in our election by pumping out fake news and allegedly colluding with the Trump campaign. Imagine how ticked off everyone would be if Russia came in and took over the White House. There would be riots in the streets, right? And so Iranians remember this. This is something that is still so key to their identity. And so what is even more troubling is that this narrative of the U.S. acting in this oppressive manner is what terrorist groups utilize to recruit, to legitimize their actions, and they just utilize it in their overall propaganda campaigns. Because as I said, people in the region remember the West and America acting in this, what they view as oppressive manner. ISIS famously erased the border between Iraq and Syria, saying that they don't believe in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And so really this dilemma of the U.S. acting in a manner which is contradictory to its values of freedom, of self-determination, is best summed up by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in this article he wrote for Politico, in which he said, "Individuals in the Muslim world do not look unfavorably upon America because of our values, but because we betrayed our values, because our values did not apply to those in the region unless it fit American interests." Now, it is very easy for us to say, okay, well, you know what, that was forever ago, that was during World War II, or that was during the Cold War, well, you know, and so America's not doing that anymore. Well, actually, America still is acting in a manner which is not conducive to valuing Muslim lives or Muslim bodies. So let's look at this in the contemporary context. Airstrikes. In the month of March alone, just in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. coalition killed nearly 1,800 civilians. 1,800 innocent people. Now, proponents of the airstrikes would say, oh, well, Usjid, that was to take out terrorists. That was to liberate, let's say, the city of Mosul in Iraq from ISIS. Now, okay, sure, I understand that. However, is it really worth engaging in those airstrikes if in our efforts to kill 2 ISIS members, we kill 5 innocents? For you see, each of those innocents who has died has friends and has family members. And so for us to assume that those individuals are not going to harbor ill will or ill feelings is just naive. And so, yeah, sure, these liberated cities from ISIS, they may not join ISIS, right? However, they definitely do not have a favorable view of the United States. And so what's stopping them from joining the ISIS of tomorrow, or ISIS 2.0? Let's also look at Yemen, which, by the way, is being incredibly underreported on right now in the news. The United States is funding Saudi Arabia's bombing campaign in Yemen. And the Saudis, unfortunately, have a proclivity to bomb funerals. Just think about that for a second. Bombing a funeral where they are mourning someone's death. Now, what do those type of actions do? They reinforce the narrative that the U.S. does not value Muslim lives or Muslim rights, which in turn makes us less safe because it makes it easier for terrorists to recruit. Let's look at drone strikes. The woman on the left is Lisa Ling, and she works on the military's drone program. Now, when talking about drones, she says that she considers drones to be terror, for we cannot fight a war on terror with more terror. As people take the humanity out of the conversation, and humanity is what we need to be talking about. Again, she's getting back to the whole idea of, are we really valuing the lives of people on the ground? Senator Chris Murphy, pictured there on the right, I feel really hits the nail on the head when referring to this reckless U.S. foreign policy in Yemen, when he said that he fears an entire Yemeni population which is radicalized against the United States. A lot of people don't know this, but right now in Yemen, Al-Qaeda controls significant portions of the country. And so part of that is because their message is so attractive to those on the ground because they're consistently getting drone striked by the U.S. or they're getting bombed by the Saudis, which the U.S. is funding them to do. And people on the ground are aware of this. And so we really need to start thinking about the human cost of our policies. Are they making us safer? And a lot of this reckless U.S. foreign policy comes from the rhetoric utilized by our politicians like I talked about earlier. Donald Trump famously said on the campaign trail when talking about ISIS that he would bomb the shit out of them and take their oil, right? So when you put it like that, it sounds really easy. Yeah, sure, like why not? Why don't we just kill them all, right? However, again, we need to start thinking about the people on the ground. For the territory that ISIS controls, there's a lot of innocent people there who also wish to be free from that tyranny. And so when we just lay destruction to the entire region and kill 1,800 civilians, we may have solved our terrorist problem today, but we're only creating a lot more down the road, because we are literally proving the terrorists right in their message when they say that America does not care about Muslims. And like I said, terrorists are incredibly adept at using this in their propaganda campaigns as well. Shortly after Donald Trump said that he wanted to ban all Muslims from the United States, Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, literally used that clip of him saying that and then put it out in a recruitment video to encourage others to join their organization. Again, our elected officials are making it too easy for them by saying that they want to ban Muslims and by engaging in this reckless military policy. Look, I am not advocating for a pacifist U.S. foreign policy, nor am I excusing the rights of those who wish to commit terror. I am, however, asking for a policy which is congruent to our values, which stresses things like self-determination, freedom, and values the human cost of those on the ground. Because as we've seen, this reckless foreign policy is not making us any safer. Peace will not be restored in the region simply through bombs, drone strikes, or airstrikes. It will be restored through coalition building, through diplomacy, through handshakes. And hopefully, through those handshakes, we will have a United States which is not only insulated from terror, but we will have a United States in which American Muslims, such as Mr. Syed, feel safe, protected, and accepted. Thank you.